Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States. Carter is already the longest living president in U.S. history. However, this coming Tuesday, he will pass yet another milestone, becoming the first ever president to reach 100 years of age. This is 6 years longer than George Bush Sr., and 7 more than both Ford and Reagan. Of course, the oldest serving president is the current one, Joe Biden. When he steps down on January 20th of next year, he will be 82. The other interesting thing about Jimmy Carter is the number of famous people he's related to. On the family tree I'll be showing you today, we'll see Elvis, Johnny Cash, Berry Gordy, Ed Helms, Richard Nixon, Robert E. Lee, and many other names that you'll recognize. But first, I want to show you how you can make your own family tree with the help of today's sponsor, MyHeritage. All you have to do is enter your name, your parents' names, and as much as you can about your 4 grandparents. With just these 7 names, MyHeritage can get started building a much larger family tree for you. Within seconds, it will automatically start searching its database of over 21 billion records. These records include census lists, newspapers, birth certificates, and much more, including the research done by other users. Once it finds matches, discovery links will automatically appear on your tree. If you determine that the match is correct, you might be able to add as many as 50 extra people to your tree with the simple click of a button. MyHeritage also gives you access to lots of great tools that make learning about your ancestors so much easier. So if you'd like to build your own family tree, you can sign up for a 14-day free trial of MyHeritage right now by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. As a Useful Charts viewer, you will also get 50% off their premium membership. All right, back to the family tree of Jimmy Carter. Let's start with his surname, which was brought to England during Norman times by a French knight called Le Carretier, meaning the cart driver. Over the centuries, this name eventually evolved into the more Anglo-sounding Carter. By the early 1600s, one of the descendants of that Norman knight was a wealthy London winemaker named John William Carter. He is thought to have been the father of Jimmy Carter's 9 times great-grandfather, Thomas Carter Sr., as well as John Carter, the father of Robert King Carter. Now, before we look at the Isle of Wight branch, which leads to Jimmy Carter, I first want to tell you about this Corotoman branch. John Carter, having been born in England, decided in 1635 to immigrate to the colony of Virginia. That was just 28 years after the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, the very first permanent English settlement in the Americas. So this means that the Carters go way back in terms of American history. John Carter built a plantation on the Corotoman River, hence the name of this branch. But both he and his first 2 sons died at relatively young ages, leading his 3rd son, Robert Carter, to inherit a lot of wealth at a very young age. In time, Robert went on to become the richest man in the colonies, as well as the acting governor of Virginia, which is why he was eventually known by the nickname King Carter. Now, remember, we are talking about the colonial South here. So, yes, King Carter was a major slave owner. According to his will, he had 3,000 enslaved individuals working on his 300,000 acres. One of his daughters, named Anne, married into another prominent Virginian family, the Harrisons. Her son, Benjamin Harrison V, was one of the signers of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and then his son, William, ended up becoming the 9th President of the United States. But that's not all. There was a second Harrison president as well, William's grandson, Benjamin, who became the 23rd U.S. president. Yet another prominent family in early Virginia was the Hill family, owners of the Shirley Plantation, which to this day is the oldest active plantation in the U.S. King Carter's son John married the heiress of that estate, and hence their descendants became known as the Hill Carters. The most famous Hill Carter is John's granddaughter Anne, who was the mother of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. But in this branch, I also want to point out King Carter's most senior heir, Robert Carter III. He ended up having some sort of religious awakening that led him to do something very unusual for the time. He started freeing all of his slaves, emancipating over 500 enslaved individuals by the time of his death, which ended up being the largest emancipation in the U.S. prior to the declaration made by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Okay, let's now look at the Isle of Wight branch, which is so named because that's the county in Virginia where Thomas Carter Sr. settled. He was either the brother or the nephew of John Carter of the Corotoman branch. As a whole, the exact details of the Isle of Wight branch are a little less certain, but we do know that we eventually get a descendant of Thomas Carter Sr. named Kindred Carter, who was the first person in this line to settle in Georgia, Jimmy Carter's home state. For the next few generations, the Carters operated cotton farms, and yes, they were indeed slave owners. In fact, during the Civil War, Jimmy Carter's great-grandfather, Littlebury Carter, fought on the side of the Confederacy. Take note that Littlebury's mother was Anne Ainsley, who was a descendant of a certain Richard Morris. Well, guess who was also a descendant of Richard Morris? Richard Nixon, the man who was president just 3 years before Carter. This makes Nixon and Carter sixth cousins. But back to Littlebury Carter. After the Civil War, Littlebury continued to farm, but he also became the part owner of a merry-go-round in town. At age 42, he and his business partner got into a fight, which resulted in Littlebury being stabbed in the neck. He died 1 week later, and then just a few hours after the funeral, his wife died as well. The papers say it was from a broken heart, but I'm thinking maybe suicide. Either way, their son Billy, Jimmy Carter's grandfather, was left without parents at age 15. He ended up doing well for himself, though, eventually owning a winery, several sawmills, and a store. But then history repeated itself. Billy accused some tenants of stealing a desk, and they responded by beating him up and then shooting him in the back while he tried to crawl away. Witnessing the whole thing was Jimmy Carter's father, James Sr., who was only 9 years old at the time. At this point, Billy's widow, Nina, and their 6 children moved to Plains, Georgia, to be near extended family. After serving stateside during World War I, James Sr. ended up operating a small grocery store, and then later, more famously, a peanut farm, along with several other agricultural ventures. Just before his early death from cancer, he also served for 6 months in the Georgia State House of Representatives as a Democrat. Let me now switch gears and tell you a bit about the other side of Jimmy Carter's family, that of his mother, Lillian Gordy. She, too, was the descendant of slave owners, the most recent being her grandfather, James T. Gordy. When he was 26, he impregnated an enslaved 14-year-old girl named Esther Johnson. Now, whether or not this was a forcible rape, it was still rape because A, she was a child, and B, he literally owned her, so true consent wasn't possible. Unfortunately, this type of thing was very common prior to emancipation, and it explains why most Black Americans today have at least some white ancestry. Esther's child was named Barry, and after becoming a free person, he too had a son named Barry, who in turn had Berry Gordy III, the founder of Motown Records. This means that Berry Gordy and Jimmy Carter are second cousins. Now, I've already done a video on the family tree of Berry Gordy and all the famous people on that tree, such as Marvin Gaye, Jermaine Jackson, Diana Ross, the guys from LMFAO, and even Beyonce. So if you want to see how Jimmy Carter is connected to all of them, you can find a link to that video in the description. But right now, I want to point out that James T. Gordy's wife was named Harriet Helms, and that she was the granddaughter of a woman named Sarah Presley. Sarah Presley was the first cousin of Andrew Presley III, who in turn was the 4 times great-grandfather of Elvis Presley. That makes Jimmy Carter and Elvis Presley 6th cousins once removed. Take note also that Sarah Presley and her sister Elizabeth both married men from the Helms family. Whereas the line of Sarah Presley Helms leads to Jimmy Carter, the line of Elizabeth Presley Helms leads to actor Ed Helms, known mostly for his role in the show The Office. Let me now return to Jimmy Carter's mother, who throughout her life worked as a nurse, even serving overseas in the Peace Corps at age 68. Whereas James Sr. was pro-segregation, Lillian was pro-integration, developing friendships in the Black community long before the Civil Rights Movement. This obviously made a strong impression on Jimmy Carter, who followed in his mother's footsteps by supporting civil rights once he was in politics. Besides Jimmy, James Sr. and Lillian also had 3 other children. Gloria was an avid motorcyclist and one of the first women to earn membership in Harley-Davidson's 100,000-mile club. Ruth, on the other hand, became a charismatic Christian and was heavily involved in the faith-healing movement. And Billy, well, he's mostly remembered for promoting Billy Beer and for causing Billygate due to some shady stuff involving Libya. But here's the strange thing. All 3 of Jimmy Carter's siblings died at relatively young ages, all from pancreatic cancer, the same disease that killed their father. But I guess Jimmy didn't get the gene for that because he escaped that fate and has now reached 100. Okay, so it's now time for me to say a few things about Jimmy Carter himself. Generally speaking, he's someone who is universally well-liked by most Americans today. For example, he's remembered as the hard-working peanut farmer and born-again Christian who once fixed a nuclear reactor while serving in the Navy, and as the long-shot politician who managed to become first a state senator, second the governor of Georgia, and then third the U.S. president. But I think it's been his life post-presidency that has really endeared him to the general public. After he left the White House, he spent many decades doing humanitarian work, in particular building homes with Habitat for Humanity, long into his old age. And while it is acknowledged that he did make several mistakes during his presidency, there is one mistake that very few people know about, mostly because it happened just a few hours before the Iran hostages were released. On his final day in office, Jimmy Carter became the only president in U.S. history to pardon someone for sexually assaulting a child. That person was Peter Yarrow, from the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. Yarrow has openly admitted that he molested a 14-year-old girl, a crime for which he was convicted. I bring this up not because I want to tarnish Jimmy Carter's reputation, but because I, as a child abuse survivor myself, take these things very seriously and wish that more people did as well. Let me now continue by telling you about Jimmy Carter's immediate family. In 1946, Jimmy married Rosalind Smith, and they remained married until her death less than a year ago. So they were married for 77 years. That's 4 years longer than Queen Elizabeth was married to Prince Philip. They had 4 children. His eldest, who goes by Jack, ran for U.S. Senator in Nevada, but lost to the incumbent Republican. However, his son, Jason Carter, went on to serve as a state senator in Georgia before losing the race for governor in 2014. Then there's Jimmy Carter III, who actually goes by Chip. He's the father of Jimmy Carter IV, who, as of yet, has not had a Jimmy Carter V. Next comes Donnell, who actually goes by Jeff. Not sure why all the boys go by other names. And then finally, there's Amy, who's the one that most people know because she was just 9 years old when her father became president and hence grew up in the White House. I should also point out Jimmy Carter's first cousin, Hugh Carter Sr., who served as a Georgia state senator for 12 years, as well as his son, Hugh Carter Jr., who served as one of Jimmy Carter's special assistants during the Carter presidency. Now, there are a lot of other famous Americans with the last name Carter that you might be wondering about, such as Sean Carter, better known as Jay-Z, as well as Dwayne Carter, better known as Lil Wayne. Unfortunately, I can't tell you for sure how they connect to this tree, or even if they do, but my guess is that they probably fit on there somewhere. Remember, going back to the early days of Virginia, the various white Carter families were among the biggest slave owners around. And sadly, as we've already seen, it was not uncommon for male slavers to impregnate enslaved females. Combine this with the fact that enslaved people were often given the surnames of their enslavers, and it's no surprise that Carter is actually the 22nd most common surname among Black Africans today, even though it's the 44th most common among white Americans. But unfortunately, it's far more difficult to find records for Black Carters than it is for white Carters. So unless a DNA test is used, it's hard to make those connections. There are, however, a few more famous Carters that we can add to the tree. If we go all the way back to John Carter, the winemaker from England, and then go up 2 generations to Richard Carter, you'll see that Richard had a brother named Thomas. If we then go 4 generations down from him, we come to another Thomas Carter, who was yet another Carter to immigrate from England to Virginia. We've called this branch the Barford branch because they initially lived on the Barford plantation, nearby King Carter's Corotoman plantation. Thomas Carter of Barford had several sons, including John Carter, who married Frances Bull, sister to Mary Bull. And Mary Bull was the mother of George Washington. So basically, the first president had an uncle who was a Carter. Thomas Carter of Barford also had a son named Thomas Jr., and if we go 5 generations down from him, we come to a single mother named Nancy Carter, who had a son named Robert out of wedlock, which is why he took his mother's surname. Robert, in turn, had several children, including his firstborn, Elvin Pleasant, better known as AP, and his fourthborn, named Ezra. In 1927, AP, along with his wife Sarah and Ezra's wife Maybelle, formed a singing group called the Carter Family. The 1920s is considered to be the decade when country music was born, and the Carter family singers were some of the very first country musicians to become big stars. Maybelle, in particular, had a very distinct style of guitar picking, and it is often credited with transforming the guitar from being a background instrument to being a lead instrument, something that not only had a big impact on country music, but later on rock music as well. After the original Carter family disbanded in 1944, Maybelle, now known as Mother Maybelle, continued to record music with her daughters, one of whom was named June Carter. In 1968, she married one of the greatest country music stars of all time, Johnny Cash. They were married for 35 years and had one child, John C. Cash, who in 2010 joined together with some of his cousins to record an album under the name The Carter Family 3. Okay, so that was a look at the family tree of Jimmy Carter. If you'd like to see the family trees of other U.S. presidents, check out the playlist that will appear on the screen shortly. And don't forget to sign up for My Heritage to start building your own family tree. Thanks for watching.